and welcome to another edition of Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham, where Team Needham discusses everything healthcare. I'm your host, Shawn Needham, along with my wonderful wife, Janet, and we are super excited to have Moira Newiss on our show today, all the way from Scotland. We've never had a guest from Scotland so far. So, Moira, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, putting Scotland on the map for this podcast.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, we love all of our guests, but we love having international guests. And it's just one of the coolest things about having our podcast. We've gotten to meet people from all over the world: Norway, Spain, England, Australia, New Zealand. Yeah. It's really, really cool. So, and one of these days we're going to have to get to Scotland. We've had many people tell us that. When we were in Istanbul, wasn't that couple from Scotland that we met?
Yeah.
So anyway, so Moira, tell us a little bit of history about metabolic mental health and how you got into this.
So I'll tell you a little bit about my own story, which is really what got me into this in the first place. So I was previously an NHS manager, that's the National Health Service in the UK, for 20 years. I was a senior manager managing hospitals, community health services, a lot of staff, a lot of, £1 million budgets. And eventually over time, my mental health started to take a bit of a toll. It had a toll on it, and eventually I burnt out. So I ended up with several different mental health diagnoses, as well as not really being able to get off the couch, look after my children. I had severe anxiety, depression, depersonalization, derealization, and chronic fatigue with it. So that was my health problem. But the way that I got my health back again, I didn't know anything about metabolic health at this time. This is, going back several years now. But I did think to myself, there must be a way of doing this without drugs. So I was offered antidepressants as the only solution. All my blood tests were normal. There was nothing, found to be problematic. And I thought, well, I'm not sure antidepressants are for me. They might be for some people, but I didn't think they were for me. So I thought I would, look at some other approaches. I did go see a psychiatrist at that point in time. And actually, I credit him with the start of my recovery, because he actually said to me, I think you might manage without drugs, and I think I should teach you how to do deep breathing. So he started me off on the lifestyle medicine kind of course that I followed. So I started with deep breathing, meditation, yoga, things like that, which definitely helped calm my sort of anxiety and hyperactivity in my brain down. But I really wasn't, I didn't get my energy back. I still wasn't feeling great. I'd lost my motivation. And along the way, I discovered a bit about nutrition. So I started eating better. I had been known in my health service job, to be surviving really on caffeine and chocolate a lot of the time, and other things that weren't particularly helpful. So I wasn't at work at this point. I'd had to give up my job. So I started to eat much healthier. And again, I felt a bit better. But it wasn't until I started training in nutrition. So I decided after a while that I would train in nutritional therapy. So I did a 3-year diploma at the Institute of Optimum Nutrition in London. And it was really in the first 6 months of that course that my attention was sparked by mitochondria. Mitochondria being the little organelles in our cells that transform energy, the food we eat and the oxygen we breathe. And I kind of got fascinated really by mitochondria and discovered the ketogenic diet at that point in time. So I thought, well, I'll experiment with this on myself. I had a great dean at the school where we were working who said, if you're going to try it, you're going to tell a client to do a diet, you really ought to know, how to do it yourself. So I thought, well, I'll give it a go. And I dabbled a bit at the beginning, but then I thought, no, I'll give it a proper go, because I'd realised that you have to kind of give it time to become fat adapted and for it to work properly. So I did a ketogenic diet for 3 months and basically just never looked back. My energy came back to like 120% of what it had been. I could race my bike again, climb the mountains. I got my clarity of mind back, and everything really resolved. And that for me was the start of my journey, because I hadn't fully finished my training at that point, but I was passionate about trying to understand what had happened. And so when I did finish my training and started up my own business, I used low carb and ketogenic diets from the beginning. And then I really went on to specialize in mental health. So I'll pause there just a sec. But that's really how I got into this in the first place.
That's a wonderful story. And I think, a lot of the things that when we get into some kind of health thing, it's because of our own personal journey, and then we want to share it with others. So I love the story. And, Jan and I are two pharmacists that don't believe in drugs to treat long-term disease. And that includes, most drugs for mental health, especially long-term. We just don't believe in them. So what are your thoughts about, will you share, did you take any medications at all in this journey?
No, I never took any. So I completely recovered without medication. However, I have to say that nearly every client I take on is on medication.
Right.
Because most of them are coming to me because medication hasn't really resolved the situation. It might have helped at times. You might, help stabilize things for a while or whatever, but it hasn't been enough. So they are still looking for a solution that is not medication, something in addition. So I'm navigating that all the time in my practice, and I do occasionally get clients that come who are not on a medication. Generally isn't actually mental health clients, maybe chronic fatigue clients or something like that, who are maybe only just come upon the problem. But most people coming to me have had, have been on, I had a lady this morning been on antipsychotics for 20 years, so most of them are long-standing, but have heard about the new ideas about metabolic mental health and want to, still are having problems, even despite being on drugs all this time, and they're really wanting to look at how can I try and resolve the symptoms that are still bothering me. Some of the symptoms might even be caused by the medication. That's what many people feel, because some of the medications might have helped them in the first place, but they've ended up with a different set of symptoms almost that maybe relate to the medication too. And then, of course, after 10 or 15 years, how do you know what's really causing the problem? It's very hard to know, isn't it? And of course, you can't come off some of these drugs quickly. You've got to be done really carefully. So I'm trying to support them to use metabolic medicine and taking a kind of brain energy approach to this. So I'm trying to look at how do we support the mitochondria to transform energy effectively? How do we bypass any energy problems that there might be? For example, using glucose as a fuel, can we use fat as a fuel instead? I'm looking at how do we try and reduce inflammation? How do we, is the immune system being activated? What else is going on? What about the gut health? All these other aspects that we know interrelate with energy. So I'm kind of taking a step back, and a lot of what I do is educational. Actually, is just try to explain to people about these different processes in the body and how food, in particular, might have an impact on it.
Well, I will tell you, as I continue to learn in my journey as a pharmacist, when we first started getting into the health and wellness space and started questioning medications, it was pretty easy to question, well, type 2 diabetes. It's a metabolic health issue. It's a diet issue. We really shouldn't need medications for that. But, the mental health part, it took me a while to think, well, wait a minute. You're really telling me that, as a pharmacist that was taught about drug therapy, that our mental health can really be changed by our diet? And of course, we've seen it happen over and over again. And I love what you say. It's metabolic mental health. As you know, Mariah, all of this comes down to our metabolic health, whether it be physical or whether it be mental. It's what we put in our bodies. It's how we move. All that stuff has to do with our brain, our blood sugar, our entire body.
Yeah, and we probably should never really have separated the mind from the body. I think that's part of the problem with this, is that we kind of separated it. And there's really interesting statistics out there. If you look at people with diabetes, they're much more at risk of developing a mental health problem. If you look at people with a mental health problem, they're much more at risk of becoming diabetic, actually. So we know these things are kind of linked. In the UK, the National Health Service has it's not exactly a requirement, but a target that everybody with a serious mental illness should have an annual physical health review. And it's because of those links. So the people with mental illness tend to die from things like cardiovascular disease, actually. So, there's even the NHS has kind of got that, but they haven't really understood yet, back to all the kind of basics about lifestyle, I think. Yeah.
Well, I think too, if we look at it historically, I think we knew food is extremely important to us. I mean, as a mother, I always knew when the grandparents sugared my kids, you know, when they came home. And I think also that, you know, in healthcare, especially in since big pharma came in, we've looked for things in the toolbox that were easy and fast, but that didn't necessarily touch on what the root problem is or was. And to think that our lifestyle doesn't play into this is really kind of silly. And one of the things that I find, and maybe you see this too, is that, you know, it's unfortunate that this happens, but it happens occasionally and probably more than I realize. But, you know, I've been in front of women and someone will say, you know, I've been on an antidepressant. Well, how long have you been on it? Oh, about 15 years. And I'm like, okay, well, what started? Like, talk to me. And, you know, many times it could be like something serious that happened in your life, you know, a death in the family or this or that happened, but nobody's ever even addressed diet, exercise, meditation, trying to get them off the medication. And when Shawn and I were first taught about these medications, they were usually not indicated for long term, but we've got people on this for decades now. So how do you address somebody that has been, I mean, because obviously there are side effects and things in their life that need to be worked on. How do you address that person that has been on these medications for so long?
Yeah, I mean, when somebody starts to work with me, I always look at their history. So, you know, I'm trying to unpick, you know, what happened. So I always want to find out, well, why did you get on these medications in the first place? And of course, there's a vast range of reasons, you know, but they are generally, you know, social, emotional, mental, you know, related situations in life, you know, stress of exams as a teenager or bullying or adverse childhood events or, you know, separation, you know, divorce. There's always kind of something behind it that there was the initial trigger, which was a stress in some form. It might have been mental and, you know, and you know, but potentially I tend to think that we think of stress in the psychological domain. And stress is actually at the level of the cells don't really differentiate between whether it's something as a psychological stress or a metabolic stress, for example. So, you know, high blood sugar is a metabolic stress. The cells, you know, that could have happened because of a mental stress, like a psychological stress, because we know that if we, you know, when the stress response is triggered, you know, we get ready to run away from a tiger or fight off somebody that's attacking us. And that changes the physiology of the body, including things like raising blood glucose, getting the heart rate, heart to beat faster, raising blood pressure, etc. But of course, so does other things. So other stressors, you know, such as eating a poor diet, can also have exactly the same effect. So although I'm looking back in the way, and you know, quite often, obviously, if it's 15 or 20 years on, you know, the original stressor might not even need addressed. I mean, it does. You know, sometimes I refer on to other practitioners if it's really obvious somebody's still carrying trauma. So I'll refer to somebody to help them, you know, deal with that in a different way. But the amazing thing about the ability that we have of using diet is that it can actually help reset metabolic health and actually reset some of these pathways that might have just been triggered originally by stress. So I kind of try and think of it, you know, as, you know, at the level of the cell and particularly the mitochondria, this, you know, that I see is a little, you can think of it like the battery in the cell, you know, are you providing it with the right nutrients? Are there things that are getting in the way of the energy flowing well? So there's a concept now called energy resistance, which if you think about an electrical circuit, you know, you've got a light bulb and a circuit. If you just have an electrical circuit and there's too much input, then it will burn out, you know, get fire. But if you have a light bulb in there and you've got the right amount of energy flow, but you've also got some resistance in the light bulb, then you get light. You know, and actually we know we need a certain amount of optimal resistance. You know, if you lay in bed all day, never moved your body, you know, that's not going to be good for you. That's not enough resistance. We need to move the body physically. Yeah, we need weight on the body, for example. We need, you know, gravity is there for a reason. We need to move the body. So it's the same with all, you know, lots of other things. Like, you know, if we live in air-conditioned houses, we don't expose ourselves to extremes of temperature again. You know, there's another stressor that's a good thing on the body. We know it helps the body adapt. So small amounts of the right, kind of stress in a way are really good for us. That's what's known as hormesis. But actually we have to get the foundations in place first. And for me, that is about getting the nutrition right and also using, stress management strategies. So things like mindfulness, meditation, yoga, whatever works for you, music. Some people just love music as a tool. I also look at things like circadian rhythm and sleep. Sleep deprivation is a major stressor on the body. Yes. Again, it can raise blood glucose, raise your blood pressure, So for me, nutrition is the basis, but then I'm trying to layer up strategies once we've got that in place. And really my aim is to get those mitochondria to just get the energy to flow as optimally as it can with the right amount of resistance is the way that I tend to look at it.
So you mentioned the keto diet. So is it mostly keto, and what made you pick the keto diet?
So I do sometimes work with low carb diets that are not necessarily ketogenic. So it depends where somebody's coming to me from. If somebody comes most people actually come to me because they know I specialize in keto. So majority of people are coming anticipating that. And I've already, they've looked at, resources that are online now. They might have read books like Chris Palmer's Brain Energy book, for example. And, they're kind of knowledgeable to some extent and have probably dabbled in low carb diets already. I do occasionally get people that haven't. And if they're currently still eating a high carb, inflammatory diet, my first thing will be to try and, take out all the processed food, make it anti-inflammatory, make it low carb and adjust the body towards that first, because if you go straight into keto from that, it's a bit of a shock to the body. Yeah. Makes the transition a bit more difficult, really. You're more likely to get some side effects. But if they're already coming and they've kind of dabbled in low carb or actually have tried to do a ketogenic diet, because a lot of people do come to me and they've actually tried to do it, but they haven't really found the sweet spot of the right ratio between the fats, the protein and the carbohydrates. Often people can be a bit afraid of fat. There's still this hangover about, we should all be low fat. That's how we were brought up. So that's an issue. So sometimes we have to kind of get over that, because actually it can be a shock how much fat you have to eat on a ketogenic diet. Sometimes people overeat protein as well. And if you're trying to get a higher ratio of fat to protein and carbohydrate. So when I'm working with clients with serious mental illness, we're quite often aiming for a slightly higher amount of ketones being produced. So, what would be known as a 2-to-1 ratio, which would be 2 grams of fat for every 1 gram of protein and carbohydrates combined. Whereas, a more kind of normal ketogenic diet, for weight loss, might be a 1-to-1 ratio. So 1 gram of fat for every combined 1 gram of protein and carbs. So either way, you're going to have to keep the carbs very low, which is usually less than 20 grams of carbohydrates. But then you've got these other, macronutrients, protein and fat, that you've got to play with and get the right balance for the client that you're dealing with.
I think that's a really good point, because I think sometimes when we get into these diets, we have this religion about where everybody should fall, but everybody's needs are slightly different. So finding that sweet spot for that person, I think, is really important, because, even when I look at my family, like my 2 boys or even my husband, my nutritional needs are way different than each of theirs, even though, genetically my kids, came from us. We have different needs as we change throughout life too. Like when I talk to women about transitioning from, your teen years to menopause, our needs change. So we need to address that individual. So I like that point.
Yeah, our needs change and our metabolic status is different as well. If you're dealing with a teenager who's physically active and, they're going to be able to have a very different approach to their food to somebody who's maybe, over 50, maybe female, past the menopause, who's, metabolism isn't working very well. And then you're going to need a really different approach. I agree. Either way, we want nutrient density in the diet.
Right.
Absolutely key, right from, infancy, right up to old age. I tend to use the approach that what we're trying to do here is we're trying to address the symptoms the client comes with. That's the key. So what we're trying to do is find the diet that best addresses that. And that is going to be different for everybody. So I have my own kind of favorite things that I kind of tend to know work for the majority, but, doesn't work for everybody. And you have to kind of adjust it a little bit to really, find what works. And I do also find that with more serious mental illness, clients often need a higher level to begin with, but actually their metabolism, once it's kind of reset, they can drop it down a bit again. So one of the most common questions I get asked at the beginning is, how long am I going to have to do this for? Will I have to do this for life? And the answer is, I don't know, because we are going to have to see what happens. I do suspect many people in this situation, like myself included, do still need to stay, in ketosis at least the majority of the time. But I do know of clients who've done a ketogenic diet and can get away with the odd meal of higher carbs. I know they might not feel the best the next day, but as long as they get back on track, they're okay. And that's entirely up to them at that point. If they want to do that, they kind of know. So if they, maybe they're going socializing and they don't want to, cause too much disruption that night, for example, and they can get away with that. But if they did it for 5 or 6 days, that might not be the same. And most of them kind of know at this point that they just have to get back on track if that happens. They might not plan for it, might happen by accident, so yeah, different approaches.
Well, and one thing, because we get that often when, somebody's going through a weight loss journey and they're like, well, how long am I going to have to do this diet? It's like, well, the diet that you were doing that made you gain 100 pounds was not working. You can't go back to doing that ever again unless you want to be 100 pounds overweight again. And it goes to do it. It's like all disease. When you got sick by eating that diet, you don't want to go back to that. So this is the diet. You might not have to be as extreme, when you're trying to heal. But like we tell type 2 diabetics, it's like, no, absolutely not. You should probably not eat any fruit. You should probably eat none until you're metabolically healthy. And then you might want to add some berries or something like that, but stay away from bananas or whatever. That's high glycemic index. And because those are just the facts. And people ask Janet and I, it's like, well, what do you guys eat? You guys eat keto or carnivore? It's like, no, we don't, but we're metabolically healthy. So we can get away with eating certain things that other people can't. And we ride our bike hundreds of miles a week. So we can get away with eating more carbs.
Yeah. I was just going to say that it's like, one of the ways, you might have heard the term, the set point for weight, like the body has a set point for weight. And the reality is the body does have a set point for weight, but actually it's different on different diets. And so, if you go back to what you ate before, which was your point there, you will go back to the weight or similar weight probably to what you were. That is, the body does seem to adjust to the diet it's on. I did hear a very interesting podcast recently about a guy that went to kayak around Greenland on the Inuit diet. And he, at the end of it, he lost weight really quickly, and he thought it was the exercise. So he thought, okay, I didn't realize this might be it, but maybe it was the diet. So he went back the following year, did the same thing, but no exercise. Exactly the same thing happened. He went back to the same weight he'd been on the Inuit diet, which was obviously high fat and protein. And he realized at that point that it wasn't the exercise at all. It was the diet that had made the difference. So yeah, absolutely. And I say to my clients, you are probably going to have to at least stay close to the line on keto. If you're not, some people might get away with more than others. It is a case of, what the metabolic health's like. Absolutely.
Well, I think too, one of the things that we've kind of lost, and I don't know when this happened to us, but I know there's things that irritate me, so I stay away from them. But I think that is something you have to learn too. Like there's certain foods that, and I'll throw it out there. Processed foods, especially fast foods, I can guarantee if I go to McDonald's, I'm going to be in the restroom within half an hour. Well, I don't like repeating that, right? So I avoid it at all costs. It's not, maybe somebody else can, but I can't. So I don't force myself to do that. And I think sometimes we forget in time, there's certain foods that are inflammatory to us as individuals, and so we should avoid. The other thing for me that I have found is I can get away with sourdough bread, but in the United States, our grain is so full of different things. It's very irritating to me. So I avoid it. It doesn't mean that maybe somebody else can do it, but I can't. So you kind of have to learn how to honor your body a little bit and find out, hey, this isn't good for me. It may not be that food is completely bad to the rest of the world, but to me, it's not working. So I should avoid it.
Yeah, and I think, dairy would be a classic here, wouldn't it? That, dairy aggravates many people, but other people can get away with it. And it's the same in the mental health world that, if a diet, quite often I won't necessarily take dairy out at the beginning of a diet because I think some people find it much easier to do a ketogenic diet within it. But, it is one of those things that we kind of look at to say, well, if we're not getting, the results we want, what else might we need to do? What are we missing, any nutrients somewhere, or is something else going on? There are obviously other things that can affect energy. There were everything from chemicals, heavy metals, all sorts of other environmental contaminants can be a problem as well. So sometimes it's like trying to unpick a jigsaw and work out what it is, and the only way to know with things like what you've just mentioned there is to take it out and see how you feel, isn't it? And then if you put it back in again, do you get the symptoms back?
Right.
And it's the gold standard way of testing a food, really. So
well, a lot of time that's what a keto or a carnivore diet does. You are eliminating a whole bunch of other things that could have been causing a problem. Later on, when you're metabolically healthy, you might be able to add some of those things slowly.
How do you feel about fasting?
Fasting, I think it very much depends on the person. I think short-term fasting, I'm a relatively big fan of. I think when you're on a ketogenic diet, it's easier to fast because you're already fueled on fat. So that transition, to using your own body fat is really easy. So, if I'm busy at a weekend, I often don't even think about food until I realize it's got quite late in the day because, your own fat supply is just taken it over. And actually, even the leanest athletes really got a marathon they can run on their own body fat. It's surprising what all of us, have the fuel on board. However, it is difficult to fast in some situations. Difficult sometimes with medication, actually, because some medications are supposed to be taken with food. Some women don't seem to, particularly women, do seem to struggle with fasting more than others. I'm just thinking, what's something I was going to say there? It's gone out of my mind. Can't remember. It'll come back to me.
That's okay. Well, I think, one of the things that the reason I bring that up is because for some people, at least in observation, they seem to drink their calories. Like when I observe even some of my younger employees, they start the day with sugar and it's just a constant thing throughout the day. So and maybe that might be something more that I'm seeing in America, or the United States, but it seems like we drink a lot of our calories and it seems to go throughout the whole entire day. So there's no span that they are having a deficit of calories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things we see here a lot, and it's maybe the same in the US, is people eating late at night. People even wake up sometimes and eat at night. I think it's just a sign that the hormonal signaling in the body's gone wrong, really. Because something's driving somebody. That's not normal behavior. So something's driving somebody to do that. And it's probably that the appetite hormones have become a bit dysregulated. If we eat late at night, that could upset the circadian rhythm, the 24-hour body clock. It can push it back the way so that, the body thinks it's daytime. All the hormones, even things like insulin, have a 24-hour diurnal rhythm, which we can upset if we're not careful. So, so for me, like when we talk about fasting, that the basic fasting would be the overnight fast. And then you would extend it with either putting breakfast back or bringing dinner forward, depending on what's a problem for you. And then, some days people might go with very little that day or go the whole day with, just with drinking and staying hydrated. And some people will do even 2 or 3 days. What I would say is that you just need to be aware that longer term fasting, you've got to be a bit careful about because it can become a stress on the body. So, you've got to kind of got to listen to your body in that situation and see, what feels right, because there's, you can fast for quite a long time potentially without problems, but I would just be careful. I'm probably not a fan of the longer fasting, but I know some people are.
Well, just like you just said, though, it is individual. It just depends on the individual. So Mariah, we're streaming your website here. Tell us about your website, and if people have any questions, how to get a hold of you.
Okay, yeah, this is me. So I'm the only one in the world with my name. I'm very lucky that way. So you can find me quite easy. you can come and see what I've got to offer. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of people I tend to work with, the kind of goals that you might, idea of whether it fits with your health goals, gives you a bit of an idea of who I am, my background. Also gives you a little bit of information on my service pages, about, some of the mechanisms, behind some of the conditions. So, for metabolic mental health or other metabolic health conditions as well. So I've got some good freebies on there. I've got a really nice brain energy ebook that's got some good tips. So that might be something that interests your audience too. And obviously I'm more than welcome for people to contact me. And if I can help, I will.
I love it. So, Moira, you've helped us realize our goal of this podcast, which is to educate and empower individuals to take charge of their own health. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you very much for having me. And
listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. Tune in Monday to our regularly scheduled podcast, 12:30 to 1:30 Pacific Standard Time. Thank you.